good afternoon, good morning, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, depending on your locations. On behalf of CUTS International, let me welcome you to this webinar, which is going to discuss Technology and Innovation Report of UNCTAD 2021. We are pleased to partner with the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development and the South Center in organizing this webinar. We have an excellent panel other than the heads of these organizations. So in my welcome remarks, I'll be very brief. You know that over the last several years, we are now, if I may use the word, confronted with a number of new technologies, whether it is artificial intelligence, robotics, machine learning, to name it. Now, there are various ways of looking at it. They can help us in their applications, can help us in accessing several accessing healthcare, education, and various other human development sources. At the same time, if we don't have the right applications or right access to those technologies, they can exacerbate inequality, poverty, and inequality. Therefore, we have to look at how these technologies can help or hinder our access to those sources. And that's the premise on which this report has been prepared. It talks about the impact of frontier technologies on inequalities. Then it talks about the role of civil society organizations in ensuring access to these technologies, particularly in respect to the social, the sustainable development goals, which we have all agreed. And most important, these sustainable development goals, they are not just talk about income aspects of poverty or inequality, but non-income aspects of poverty and inequality, and that's very important. And finally, how international cooperation can help. So with this background, let me now request Mr. Pradeep Mehta, to begin with Shamika Sirimane. She is the director in the Division of Technology and Logistics in UNCTAD for her opening remarks. Shamika, in about 4 or 5 minutes, please. Over to you.
Thank you, Bipul. Good day to all of you joining from across the world. And let me take the opportunity to thank you, CUTS and the South Center. So Pradeep, Carlos, it's great to have you in this discussion. And Bipul and Clovis, thank you very much, because I know there's a lot of work done behind the scenes to get to the webinar. So thank you very much. So, in the report, we argue that the world is at the peak of the age of ICT and is starting a new paradigm, the Industry 4.0. Bipul, you mentioned some of these technologies of the Industry 4.0 that we have covered 11 big technologies that are driving the Industry 4.0. So the AI, the Internet of Things, big data, blockchain, and so forth. And we also say that the very few countries create the technologies that drive this revolution, but all countries will be affected by it. And almost none of the developing countries we studied for our report are prepared for the consequences. And Clovis will take you through some of those numbers. And of course, as you mentioned before, each wave of technological change has brought inequality in new shapes. And the most of these Industry 4.0 technologies that are being deployed in developed countries save labor in routine tasks and increasingly in more cognitive tasks, and but largely affecting mid-level skill jobs. And these technologies reward digital skills and capital. We just have to look the last year, during COVID-19 pandemic, and we can look at the market value of the leading digital platforms of that time. The largest gains have been made by Amazon, Apple, and Tencent. And this is not surprising, given that a very small number of very large firms provided most of the digital solutions that we have used to cope with various lockdowns and travel restrictions. So this is what is shaping up with these new technologies. So as you said in this report, we looked at how should developing countries prepare for the frontier technological revolution. Of course, we advocate for a concerted, a multi-stakeholder effort, and Clovis will take you through various actions the governments, the labor unions, international community needs to do. But let me focus on the today's topic is the civil activism. And, and let's not forget the power of civil activism throughout the history, from civil rights to women's rights, children's rights, and more. And civil activism is highlighted in our report as a strong force and a force for good. So we say vigorous civil activism is critical to ensure that frontier technologies works for all and not for the few. These technologies are not deterministic, and they can be directed towards good. If left for the private sector, however, AI will just be used to entice us to buy another shirt or the blouse of the color that we like. But social activism, as civil activism, can push AI to track human trafficking. Combined with big data, AI can monitor disease outbreaks, develop vaccines for forgotten diseases of the poor. And civil activism can generate wider debates on how new technologies affect citizens' rights, privacy, data ownership, and online security. Civil activism will go a long way in calling for ethical frameworks and regulations for these technologies. If human health is subject to strict standards and regulations, as we witnessed, during COVID-19 vaccine case, and as it should be, of course, so should there be ethical standards for technologies that affect our species' future. And that's the message of this report. In fact, we gathered ethical frameworks and guidelines for AI for this report, and we found 167 of them. And they are all reported in a report in an annex. And these are mostly done by private sector firms and some academics with inconsistencies and sometimes also contradictions. So the big tech cannot be trusted to come up with ethics. These must be international multi-stakeholder efforts with developing countries at the table. So I am very happy to see we have a very solid lineup of speakers that will speak about how to mobilize civil activism to ensure that this technological revolution works for all and not for the few. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shamika. So going forward, let me now request Mr. Pradeep Mehta, Secretary General CUTS International, and
thank you,
our
Bipul.
boss.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And it's so nice to hear Shamika after a long time. And thanks for this virtual world, Rob, etc., who we have been. I wish this was done physically. But anyway, because of the problems that we had. Technology has been a solution to our being able to converse or have this dialogue, have this better understanding about. And that is something which must recognize that there is a multifold growth in the domain of IT, information and technology. As we've seen from the dawn of this century, expansion in research on computing power and innovation is witnessing the development of advanced technologies at a pace faster than any other time in the history of mankind, which Shamika recalled, particularly Industry 4, and what is the kind of catalytic effect it has had in our understanding about technology. And many of us are still grappling with these changes. Complex technological solutions to societal issues have been demanding attention and have fueled the revolution of societies and democratization of participation in terms of the civil activism. A small body of research exists around the evolution and growth of civil societies, and an even smaller group addressing the crossover between civil societies, digital revolution, and its implications. Shamika, this is an agenda for your division to look at more closely as we evolve as a must point out of this particular webinar. In the recent past, internet and telephone world has demonstrated the power of the ever modernizing network technologies, fostered user engagement, and have broadened the scope for the global economy. For instance, let me go back to the M-Pesa, the mobile money system in Kenya, which was a great success. And it has had a catalytic effect around the world. This, the whole thing has made life much more easier. When you look at, my friend Peter Mwencha is from Nairobi, and I'm sure he'll be able to also reflect on what I've just said as something which we need to recall as a past in terms of technology and innovation. There are, if you look at the continent of Asia, there are developing countries at various stages of development in terms of experimenting and innovating and integrating technology into industries that have seen an increase in usage and footfall since the pandemic. Pandemic particularly has been a turning point in terms of one of its positive outcomes. Of course, the negative outcomes are still huge, and we're still grappling with what is going to happen in the near future. To give you an example, I mean, India has been one of the few nations that have been successful in the COVID-19 vaccine area, as was mentioned by Shamika as well, in terms of the modern needs, etc. Apart from China, India is the only nation that has developed an indigenous vaccine and manufactured it at a breakneck speed. A second one on license from abroad has been made available. There's 2 vaccines to people in India and abroad, and there are more which are there on the anvil. Millions of units of this vaccine have been shared by India to over 75 countries by either way of gift or even at a low price. Now, what is the reason behind it? We must understand the root issues. The Indian education system has also been immensely successful in developing this capability, as well as in the face of pandemic, in breaking geographical barriers and overcoming the challenge of our infrastructure to ensure a continued flow of virtual learning to the students in the nation. As more educational institutions in India have started adopting the medium of digital learning, and not only India, I think around the world, it has provided the opportunity for personalized and interactive teaching. I'm looking at the positives of virtual learning. Of course, there are downsides as well. The intersection of education technology in the future is going to redefine the student experience in the world. And what will happen in India will set an example for the rest of the world. The domain of information and technology in India provides both opportunities and challenges. Just like India leapt into mobile telephony with a strong financial technology ecosystem, from being an unbanked nation a few years ago, emerging technologies have provided India with the potential to spearhead innovation and development into the next generation. By sustaining its reform movement, seizing opportunities and providing benefits to manufacturers, the challenges can be overcome. Now, all this is all being discussed under the Industry 4 umbrella as well. During the last quarter of 2019, CUTS International Washington DC Center organized 2 roundtables in Washington DC and New Delhi on innovation, and Rob Atkinson was one of our panelists in DC. And some of the takeaways which are very important for us to understand in terms of how we deal with this in future. First is the need for optimal governance framework. Structuring a balanced regulatory framework for innovation across sectors to enable higher productivity. Now, it is important for both, whether you look at people or businesses or governments, as to how do we arrive at some kind of better understanding is to ensure that the regulatory framework which evolves is pro-development and not anti-development or not anti. Second is innovation is a bonding factor. That is what we've seen. I mean, knowledge sphere is a foundation for bilateral relations between India and the US, for example. Hence, collaborative endeavors in innovation around the world, across the world, should be promoted vigorously. Third, incentives. Retaining and India is strategically poised to develop the next wave of technological advancement, and recent policy interventions on terms of startups have ensured that progress is made in this direction. We have one problem in India, which is what may also be seen in other parts of the world, this restricted flow of data. The success of India's IT industry is largely attributed to the routine flow of cross-border data from abroad and back. It should not be curtailed. Unfortunately, the thinking in the government is that this is something which is being stolen from India. But anyway, let me, what we need to understand is for continuous growth of the global economy and innovation, it is important that data must flow freely. The next point which came up there was, again, very important, Shamika. This is something which Untitled is working on in a different division. IPRs, for example. Starters of IPRs are again very important for us to understand that how do you protect innovations, and brand reputation is extremely critical. Going further, addressing challenges faced by civil societies in developing nations should be a priority. And that is where UNCTAD has been doing excellent work in terms of the developing world and working with the civil society closely as well. So once a challenge that puts the civil societies in a deadlock is that of implementing technology-based solutions due to their lack of resources, training of staff, and platform management. Here exists the potential of an emerging fourth sector, as mentioned by the CEO of PACT International, who suggests a convergence between the verticals of the government, private sector, and the civil society, which could help with mutual growth and development. Such virtual meetings are extremely important in understanding the role of innovation in strengthening the research and development. This is apart from addressing the challenge they pose in the policy and regulatory perspectives. The sectors in focus of this webinar include, but are not limited to, frontier technology, as you mentioned, Shamika, sustainable development, innovation, equity, and the role of civil society organizations in influencing developing countries to adopt frontier technologies. I thank UNCTAD for collaborating with us on this roundtable, and the South Center, ETC group, etc., to also be as a co-organizer or co-panelist in this particular. And let me conclude by thanking all the speakers in the panel and the participants for taking time out of their busy schedules in joining us today. Thank you very much. Vipul, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mehta. Let me now turn to Mr. Correa, Carlos Correa, for your opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Vipul. On behalf of the South Center, let me welcome all speakers and participants. We are really very happy to be able to co-organize with UNCTAD and CATS this important meeting. Let me also commend the Secretariat of UNCTAD for the preparation of this report, with very well elaborated report with very good information, and that leads to a very important conclusion. Some of them have already been summarized by Shamika. So let me make a few observations in connection with the content of the report. The first one is that one of the main messages of this report is that dissemination of the so-called frontier technologies does not necessarily mean that they bring equal opportunities to all developing countries. So the issue of inequality, which is created by these technologies, I think is a crucial element of this report. And I think it's very important that UNCTAD has elaborated on this issue. As we know, and this is also reflected in the report, the old paradigm, the changes in the technological paradigm has had the same impact, has not brought about necessarily more equality, but it has deepened asymmetries, in some cases within societies and quite clearly between countries or among countries. So I think this is a very important message that the report is bringing about. The second comment is about the so-called frontier technologies. So these technologies are not as new as many may think. For instance, in the case of robotics, of artificial intelligence, or even the solar cells, they were born in the 50s. That means 70 years ago. Some of these technologies, of course, are quite new, such as the gene editing, which is mentioned in the report, also the blockchain or 5G, but many of the frontier technologies have been there for a long time. What has happened, however, is that the efficiency of the technology has improved a lot. The scope of application has expanded significantly, and the dissemination of this technology has accelerated. And this has created new challenges for developing countries. And these challenges are also, in some cases, affected or increased or exacerbated because of the issue which is also raised in the report, stringent intellectual property rights regime, which may allow developing countries to become users of these technologies, but not to be part of the innovation process, which is key for developing countries. So if we want these technologies to have a positive impact in terms of development in developing countries, they should not be seen just as users of these technologies, but participate in the innovation process, because this technology was also suggested by Shamika, will create jobs in developed countries, but will destroy jobs in developing countries. So there is a need to ensure that there is more more equality in terms not just of being user of this technology, but being able to participate in the innovation process. So this brings me to a third comment, and this relates to the fact that the incorporation and to draw benefits from these technologies is not automatic. I think in some cases, in particular with previous techno-economic paradigm, which was developed on the basis of microelectronics, there were some economists talking about leapfrogging. So the idea that some countries can just jump in development terms by incorporating technologies without going through the sometimes painful step-by-step process of development. And I think this report also highlights the fact that in order to benefit from these technologies, you need to invest, you need to develop local capacities. And in this regard, it's very useful, the concept of the 5 A's: availability, affordability, accessibility, awareness, and ability. In general, in the context of discussion, for instance, on access to medicines, we only talk about availability, affordability, and accessibility, but it's important to include in particular ability, because ability means that in order to benefit from these technologies, you require absorption capacity. You require the capacity in the country in order to absorb technology, as I mentioned before, not just as a user, but also as an innovator, also as a country or a group of countries that can participate in the innovation process. So this webinar is particularly relevant, and thanks again for inviting the South Center to participate in the organization of this webinar. It's very pertinent to talk about the role of civil society organization, because civil society organization bring this understanding of local conditions. So they may have a crucial role in not only disseminating these technologies, but also in learning how these technologies can be actually adapted to local conditions, and how developing countries can further participate in the innovation process. So this organization can play a crucial role both in terms of diffusion and also contributing to develop local knowledge in order to adapt these technologies to develop local application. For instance, digital health has been mentioned, that could be an important contribution. Just to end, let me mention that the South Center published recently on April 6th a paper, the title of which is "Technology and Inequality: Can We Decolonize the Digital World?", which also addresses some of these issues. This is a paper by Padma Sri Sampath. So this also supplements some of the views which are presented in the report. And again, we are very happy for participating in this meeting, and we expect a very fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. Thanks for reminding us about those A's. They are very important. Whenever we talk about any security, whether it is food or health or whatever, those are the A's that we need to keep in mind. With that, let me now turn to Clovis. I understand that Clovis is going to make a presentation, not just about this report, but more importantly, about the role of civil activism in ensuring that technological revolutions, they do not increase or create new inequalities. So over to you, Clovis. I understand that you were going to take about 10 minutes.
Thank you, Vipul. So colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So allow me to highlight some of the new analysis of the UNCTAD's 2021 Technology and Innovation Report. So the report highlights that the great divides between countries that we see today is started after the Industrial Revolution. Since then, every wave of progress was associated with sharper inequality. Now the gap in average income per capita between developed and developing countries is about $40,000. We know that few countries, notably from Asia, were able to catch up, and they do that through technological learning, imitation, and innovation. Many factors affect the dynamics of economic inequality, including wars, epidemics like the pandemics now, and the effects of trade and globalization. But one of the factors is the impact of technological revolutions, the techno-economic paradigms that Carlos was mentioning. The report argues that the world is at the peak of the age of ICT and is starting the new paradigm of Industry 4.0. The development of ICT resulted in an enormous concentration of wealth in the ownership of major digital platforms. There is also persistent digital divides, as highlighted in the uneven access to the benefits of digital technology now during the COVID-19 pandemic. So how frontier technologies will affect inequalities between countries will depend on many factors, but particularly national policies and the involvement of countries also in international trade. The report covers 11 frontier technologies. They are artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, big data, blockchain, 5G, 3D printing, robotics, drones, gene editing, nanotechnology, and solar PV. Estimates suggest that these technologies already represent $350 billion market, and one that by 2025 may grow to over $3.2 trillion. Many of the major providers of these technologies are from the United States and China, which are responsible for between 30% to 60% of patents and publications. A new readiness index presented in the report gives us a picture of the national capabilities to equitably use, adopt, and adapt frontier technologies. In general, the economies most ready for the equitable deployment of frontier technologies are in North America and Europe. The top 10 are the United States, Switzerland, United Kingdom, Sweden, Singapore, Netherlands, Republic of Korea, Ireland, Germany, and Denmark. China ranks in 25, Russia 27, Brazil 41, and India 43, and South Africa 54. Most least ready countries are in the sub-Saharan Africa. But there are clearly many outliers, countries that perform better than their per capita GDP would suggest. The great outperformance is India, ranking 65 positions higher than expected, followed by Philippines, which ranks 57 positions higher. Countries that outperforms have invested in R&D, industrial activity, their productive capacities, access to finance. But most of these countries were not as successful in ICT infrastructure, in internet access, and digital skills. So this is something that developed countries need to pay more attention to. Another novelty of the Technology Innovation Report 2021 is that it considers the impact of frontier technologies through the production side and also through the user side. Some other reports usually tend to focus either one or the other. From the production perspective, each wave of technological change brings inequality in new shapes. Today, a major concern is that AI and robotics will reduce employment. But most alarmist estimates of doomsday scenario do not consider that not all tasks and jobs will be automated. And most importantly, that new products and tasks and professions and economic activities are created throughout the economy. So if we analyze in the report also that the impact of AI on inequality between countries will depend on the type of input data using AI. If AI primarily use big data generated by users, this will mainly benefit the United States and China. Their competing digital platforms get massive amount of user data. If AI primarily use big data generated by Internet of Things, this may also benefit other countries with strong manufacturing base, such as countries in EU, Japan, Republic of Korea. But if computers learn more like humans by recognizing patterns and generalizing from few examples, this would still require capabilities that are more likely to be found in developed countries, so leaving developing countries behind. Another concern is job polarization, the expansion of high and low wage jobs and the contraction of middle wage jobs. But not all job polarization can be attributed to technological change. Much of this is related to outcome of trade and international competition. And in developed countries, it's true that from 2000 to 2020, job polarization was associated with a 4% reduction of medium skill jobs. But actually, in lower middle income developing countries, there was an increase of 6% of middle skill jobs in the same period. So it is expected that low and lower middle income developing countries will be less affected or exposed for the potential negative effects of AI and robots on job polarization. So preparing for technological revolution requires the promotion of their development, use, adoption, and adaptation. But developing countries face many challenges, and the report highlights 5 of them. The first is the change on demographics. By 2050, most of the increase in population will be in sub-Saharan Africa, with an increase of approximately 1 billion people. So firms in Africa may have fewer incentives to use automation as a form of saving labor costs. Another challenge is the technological gap. In the past 30 years, the gap output per worker between low and high-income countries increased from about $60,000 to $90,000. The risk is the low-income countries will fall further behind in the adoption of Industry 4.0, widening this technological gap. Yet another challenge is this low diversification of many developing countries that continue dependent on commodities instead of relying more on manufacturing. And we know that common technologies using in manufacturing helps firms to adopt and adapt new technologies. Another challenge is that developing countries, particularly the least developing countries, have less public and private resource to fund research and innovation. And another factor that was mentioned by previous now is that these stringent intellectual property rights is also likely to reinforce existing technological divides. So developing countries need to adopt frontier technologies while continuing to diversify their production base by mastering existing technologies. They should have these both targets in sight. So in face of that, many national and local governments are already stimulating the growth of new industries and servicing frontier technologies. To be fully effective, they need to align innovation and industrial policies, keeping the national industry competitive. This will require better access to patent technology and opportunities for technological learning through better public-private R&D. Finance for innovations can come from official source and alternative funding, including impact investment, venture capital, crowdfunding, innovation, and technology funds. At the same time, policymakers need to anticipate the impacts on the workforce, which may need competence on science, technology, engineering, as well as design, management, and entrepreneurship. There is also a need for renewed importance of the role of the labor unions to protect the rights of the workers in the digital economy. And workers should also be able to rely on stronger mechanisms of social protection and different forms of income redistribution. There are many proposals to finance such measures, which needs to be carefully considered. As was highlighted before, now if we turn to the other side of the analysis, the potential impact of technology on inequality through the perspective of the users of technology, of course, we know that these technologies have great potential in all areas of sustainable development, but one of the most critical aspects is access, which can be considered comprised this combination of the 5 A's of availability, affordability, awareness, accessibility, ability to effective use. So access to technology can be also restricted by social norms for women, ethnic minorities, other disadvantaged groups, even within the same household. So the other aspect is the design of the technology and goods and services using the technology. Technology frontier or otherwise may support initiatives of all kinds, but they need to be designed carefully to help rather promote unintended side effects. Again, the developing countries face challenges in the access and deployment of these technologies. The major issue is the higher level of poverty in developing countries. As you know, upper middle income and high income developing countries, the average share of population living in poverty is about 2%, but in low income countries, this can be as high as 45%. As a result, access to goods and services is more difficult for a larger share of the population in developed countries. In this case, the barriers are not technological at all, but economic and social. Another challenge is the digital divide. Almost half of the world's population remain offline. And there is, of course, also a significant shortage of skills in developing countries when compared with developed countries. Another major concern nowadays is related to the bias design and unintended consequence of AI and inequalities and ethical considerations on gene editing. So biased AI systems can arise because they employ biased algorithms or biased data from training, and this biased data is generating the real world, so it reflects the bias and discriminations that we have in society. For example, one study found that being signed as a woman in the Google services resulted in likelihood of seeing advertisements for higher paying positions, a much lower likelihood of seeing these advertisements. Regarding gene editing, there is a great concentration of the benefits of the technology in developed countries. A 2017 study showed that most of the clinical trials in gene editing therapy is in the US and Europe. And also gene editing also raised ethical questions related to what constitutes an ideal human being. And there could be a result of an underclass of people that could not afford these genetic treatments. So to overcome this challenge, the international community needs to guide frontier technology to support development and support development that is sustainable and inclusive, leaving no one behind. And it's crucial to establish ethical frameworks, as mentioned by Shamika. The reports listed 167 of them related to AI. We need to also have such broad consensus and ethical and societal issues in gene editing part. So against this backdrop, what is the role of civil activism? And the report highlights several of them. First, we have to acknowledge that with the increasing interconnection of digital and physical worlds, social and digital inequalities are becoming the same. It is not possible to tackle one without addressing the other. Civil activism is badly needed to keep the fight for equality, for reducing socioeconomic and digital inequalities everywhere. Second, the dissemination of frontier technologies and the resulting changes in the economy will require accompanying changes in society and institutions, but these changes tend to lag the economic change due to the strong societal and institutional inertia. So laws, regulations, and behavior that were adequate to deal with the previous technologies are ill-suited to address new challenges, but it takes time for them to change. So in the past technological revolutions, it took 1 or 2 generations to have these changes completed. Social activism is needed to break this inertia and to promote the required societal change. Third, social activism is needed to keep government and business, including financial sector, accountable for the roles that they play in steering development and dissemination of frontier technology. So we need civil society to keep us committed to the sustainable development goals and the long-term development prosperity goals and protection of the planet. Fourth, some of the mobilizing themes of organized civil society movements are very well known. So gender equality, climate change, fight against racism, but technological change present these issues in new shades and forms, and also bring to light new issues that are not in the radar yet for many people, such as data privacy, ethical issues related to social media, and so on. Thus, social activism in these areas serve to the essential purpose of raising awareness of these issues. And fifth, it may take time, but the combined efforts of civil society groups can eventually create a critical mass that could trigger change in behavior of users and consumers, and in regulations and laws, and also in the supply side that could align technological development with societal goals. So in conclusion, the Technology Innovation Report 2021, it highlights that technology rarely is a solution on its own. Problems such as poverty, hunger, climate change, or inequalities in health, education, and all areas of development are complex and multidimensional. Frontier technologies can bring transformative power, but they need to be steered with an inclusive development compass and an eye on the unintended side effects. This concerns all countries, but not all countries are equally prepared for it. We should re-legitimize the role of government as critical for building new technological innovation capacity. We need to foster civil society participation in shaping more equal and sustainable technological paths. And we need to have strengthened international cooperation for facilitating technological learning in developing countries. Developing countries, particularly low-income countries, cannot afford to miss this new wave of technological change. Each country will need science, technology, innovation policies that are appropriate to their stage of the development to prepare their people and firms for this period of rapid change. This will require a balanced approach between building a robust industrial base and promoting frontier technology that can help deliver the 2030 agenda. I conclude now the presentation. Thank you very much, people.
Thank you, Clovis. This report and your presentation reminds me about the work of many development economists of 1950s and 60s, including Sir Arthur Lewis. I'll come back to this point. The issues which we discussed during those days, what are the changes which have happened over these several decades, fairly long run, and what lessons that we can draw from them. Anyway, so let's come to the panel now. Let me first request Net for her thoughts, views, particularly about the role of civil activism in addressing socio-economic and ecological issues surrounding new technologies. Net, your thoughts in about 8 to 10 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you, Bipul, for the kind introduction. I'd like to thank UNCTAD, in particular the Office of Shamika, and Clovis in particular for leading this the development of the Technology and Innovation Report for 2021. And the report underscores that a precautionary assessment of the impacts of frontier technologies has become more urgent than ever before, particularly as converging technologies that characterize the fourth industrial revolution work in concert, and as a small number of large corporations control greater and greater portions of the natural world. This concentration of scientific know-how can undermine the ability of countries and people to decide what technologies are appropriate for their own circumstances. Currently, there is absence of international governance of new technologies. There is no multilateral body specifically mandated to take on governance and regulation of emerging technologies, making the world into an experimental wild west, where anything goes for those with money and capacity to experiment and deploy new technologies. The technology cycle is seen as a research, development, diffusion, deployment cycle, but there is no international process where technologies are carefully evaluated for their social, environmental, and other impacts before they are rushed out to the market. Who decides what technologies get deployed and under what conditions? How can we avoid jurisdiction shopping, whereby a technology prohibited in one country does not simply move to the next, which may be less aware and therefore less vigilant about its risk? The TIR 2021 has really emphasized the miserable inequity in terms of capacity to innovate and much more, to evaluate new technologies across the world, particularly between the North and South. With new technologies that purport to manipulate entire planetary systems and build new life forms from scratch, an international governance mechanism has become an urgent matter. Precaution demands the careful assessment of technologies before, not after governments and intergovernmental bodies start funding their development and aiding their deployment around the globe. There's already a precedent in international law in Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. National and international programs of public consultation with the participation of people who are directly affected are critical. People must have the ability to decide which technologies they want and to reject technologies that are neither environmentally sound nor socially equitable. The role of civil society in technology assessment is critical. Recognizing the political forces at play in the acceptance or rejection of new technology, the formation of dynamic civil society mechanisms that can offer an independent monitoring and assessment capacity to accompany intergovernmental processes should be promoted and encouraged. This initiative should encourage the formation of self-organized civil society structures at the regional and inter-regional level that could guide technology assessment platforms that are capable of undertaking regionally relevant reports on technology risk and opportunities to inform decisions of countries, institutions, and the UN. The recent decision of the Swedish Space Corporation, for example, to stop an experiment on solar radiation management involving stratospheric aerosol injection in partnership with a research group in Harvard is a clear example of how broad opposition from indigenous people, civil society, and academia could actually impact the process of research and could actually shape the direction of research. As a tool for inclusive approach in technology governance, ETC Group is proposing a system called GOAT. It's unfortunate that I cannot flash my screen now because I have to use my phone because of low bandwidth on the Wi-Fi here. We call this approach GOAT, or Global Overview Assessment of Technological Systems. GOAT offers an exploratory approach for policymakers, civil society, and others to better perceive and navigate the rocky innovation landscape ahead and to understand the potential promises and pitfalls in advance. GOAT is proposed as a bottom-up technology landscaping project involving multi-actor assessments organized thematically around the 17 SDGs. So this is actually a proposal side by side with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Through engagement with society, the GOAT will first build up a field of view of key technologies, innovations, and technological visions that are shaping the different themes under the discussions in the HLPF. It will then attempt to anticipate and evaluate the potential societal implications of key technological developments on the SDGs. GOATs could serve as an essential input to the deliberations of the UN Technology Facilitation Mechanism in the HLPF, as well as input to the Global Sustainable Development Report of the UN. In this proposal, the GOAT proposal, ETC Group suggests a process that would combine experience from multi-actor global overview assessment with the methodology of technology landscaping and the practices of participatory technology assessment. The aim is to design a light but inclusive process grounded in participation that welcomes diverse experiences, values, and perspectives as inputs. The aim is to synthesize and generate useful knowledge for policymakers and society to exert governance over science, technology, and innovation. We envisage GOAT process as overseen by either a multi-actor governance group or by an explicitly citizen-led secretariat committed to ensuring that participatory methods are employed and that diverse voices are heard. The GOAT project would proceed in 5 stages, namely survey, situate, sampling, assess, suggesting. It involves surveying, mapping, and clustering technologies, which involves identification of thematic focus in line with the discussions in the HLPF or the SCI forum, and also to include existing technologies as well as emerging and speculative technologies that would have special focus in identifying technologies that are new and under development. In that process, in situating technologies, we propose that a mapping of innovation agenda should be part of GOAT. Because new technologies do not arrive from the sky. The process of innovation is often driven consciously or unconsciously by larger innovation agendas and visions, including cultural and industrial projects, and are shaped by investments organized around those agendas. By mapping innovation agendas that are bearing down on thematic area, it is possible to understand which sort of applications may be more likely arise towards which outcomes and with what resources and economic political support. The next stage in the GOAT process is sampling or case studies, which would choose significant case studies and develop fuller picture of these technologies, and choosing them based on nearer term and longer term technologies, as well as identify technologies that appear to have considerable political or financial support. The next stage in GOAT is assessing using participatory technology assessment, which we as envisage is the most participative, drawing on material already developed through this process of GOAT. It would involve, it could be narrowly framed around case studies or processes that could be designed to draw out overarching assessments across the technology landscape. Civil society are currently experimenting with organizing into regional networks for participatory technology assessments. There's one in Africa called APITAP. There's also one in Latin America called TECLA, and there's initiative to set up in Asia Pacific as well called TAPAP. Lastly, GOAT would recommend concrete ideas and concrete suggestions for science, technology, and innovation governance. Evidence suggests that effective global assessment processes are those with more formal ties to policy processes, as we can see in the IPCC, for example, which formally input into the UNFCCC negotiating process. We envision that GOAT could actually be designed to thematically mirror priorities in the HLTS and could provide input directly into those processes. While framing conclusions across a landscape assessment may be challenging, such recommendations could span from process questions to content and technology-specific recommendations. Lastly, while technology does hold some potential solutions to some important global problems, through decades of accelerating technological development and deployment in the context of massive trade and investment liberalization, as described by Carlos, has left the globe in far worse straits than it was when the very concept of sustainable development was in its infancy, sadly. New high-risk technologies, as described in the Tier 2021, are rapidly developing. The strict application of Rio principles, namely precautionary principles, free and prior informed consent, access to information, participation in decision-making, and access to justice, intergenerational justice, and transparency and participation in technology assessment are much more relevant now than ever, despite efforts in the past 2 decades to put aside and undermine these principles. So thank you for the opportunity to share this approach that we are evolving towards innovation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ned. Let me turn to Rob now. Rob, after hearing this presentation and also Ned's views, what do you think about the role of civil society organizations in promoting these frontier technologies, particularly in developing countries like us, in a way that is both productivity enhancing and socially just? So it will be great to hear your views on these points. Over to you, Rob, in about 8 to 10 minutes.
Beautiful. Well, thank you. It's a really pleasure to be here, even if it is somewhere in the middle of the night here. So this was a really fascinating conversation and super important one. And in a lot of ways, it's hard to do justice to it in 7 or 8 minutes, but I will give it a shot. I guess the first point, and I'll come back, Upai, to the notion of civil society, but my first point would be, I think the overarching question really that has to be answered is, what's the major goal here? Is it to steer the technology, or is it to promote the technology? And I kind of heard Pradeep saying that we need to also promote it. And I didn't hear that as much from some of the other presentations. You know, one of the, and I saw there was a piece up there on the slide from oh, why am I blanking on her name? Anyway, she talks about installation periods, that book. And one of the things that she talks about in that book about installation of these new tech systems, if you will, these techno-economic paradigms, is they are massive engines of growth. So if you look at certainly developed country productivity, but also developing country productivity over the last 15 years has not been as strong as it was in that prior period, because we're between the ICT period and this new Industry 4.0 period. So I think that's really an important point. When we get to this Industry 4.0 installation, this is, sorry, Carlota Perez's work. When we get to installation, where we're not at yet, we're not even at installation in the US or Japan or Europe, but when we get to installation, that's going to be a significant engine for growth. And so to me, it's not just about sort of steering and worrying about the problems, it's making sure that we and civil society and other bodies enable that installation, because that installation is going to provide massive growth. That gets to the second point, which is, well, how do we think about installation? Installation is going to, I think, clearly have differing effects on countries. And we recently wrote an article for Georgetown, some journal on that. And I, at least my estimation, I think others, is that, you know, the last wave tended to help lower cost countries because you created a global production system that you could move production to lower wage countries. And sure, okay. I think this next wave, though, is a little different in the sense of it can reduce labor cost differential matters. In other words, we did a study looking at robot adoption, and the economics of installing a robot in a place like Africa or the Philippines is not very good. Robots get installed for one principal reason. I'm oversimplifying, but that's to save labor costs. And there are other reasons to improve quality and the like. But when labor costs are so low, you're not going to install as many robots. And I think that's an interesting question, because that could suggest some challenges in traded sectors for developing countries. That's why I think the idea of a robot tax would be exactly the wrong way to go. It's going to be hard enough installing robots in places like India or Africa or Latin America. And then putting a robot tax on that would be much harder, make it much harder. The other thing I would say is, I don't know that the challenge is, I understand the notion that lower income and developing countries want to be developers as well as adopters. And I think that makes sense in a very narrow sense. There's just simply no way, in my opinion, that most countries are going to develop the next big technology companies. That's just not going to happen. It's too hard. I mean, Europe, with all of the resources Europe has, they're trying, and to me, a fool's errand to try to replicate Google, Amazon, Facebook, et cetera. It'll never happen. I mean, they tried that against IBM in the 60s, and they, you know, essentially wasted tens of billions of dollars, and they'll probably waste tens of billions of dollars on that errand again. What Europe can do, and what they're doing as well, is, and I think Clovis talked about that in his slide, is they're working on Industry 4.0 technologies around enterprises where they do have real strengths. So I think an important thing is for developing countries to think about what are their niche strengths that they have and focus on those. There are lots of areas around data and analytics and AI and other, certainly IoT, that could be uniquely applied and developed for developing country solutions. And there's no reason why developing countries couldn't also be generating those and selling those around the world. But the idea that somehow they're going to develop the next Apple or Amazon, I'm skeptical. Overall, I kind of put India in a little bit different category. India to me is they're just in a different category because India is so strong when it comes to IT services. And that really sort of this other point about what Pradeep said about, which I 100% agree with, allowing cross-border data flows. We have a new report coming out in the next couple of weeks, basically arguing that the US and India should have this much grander alliance to sort of counterbalance China. And that alliance should be based in part around ICT complementarities. But the Indian trade surplus with America in IT services is really huge. India is doing great there. So the idea that you would want to sort of restrict data flows, I think could be really harmful to developing an economy that has IT services exports. One other thing I'll just say, and then I'll go to the point. This notion somehow that low income or developing countries are being exploited because of data, and this notion we hear of data is the new oil, I actually think it's exactly 180 degrees opposite. 180 degrees opposite. Right now we're using Zoom. I assume most people on this call use Facebook. Probably many of you are on Twitter. And you pay the same price I pay, which is zero. These are, you don't pay a monetary fee for those. But what you sort of pay in a way is you get targeted advertising. And so you're paying with your eyeballs, essentially. Well, the advertising value of a person who makes $10,000 a year is worth 10 times less than somebody who makes $100,000 a year. So the amount of money that these quote imperialist colonizer companies are making out of per capita in Africa or in India is very, very small. They're making a lot of money on me, people like me in Washington, in the US, and they're making very little, yet they provide the exact same service. And I think that's an important point to make. They're not exploiting countries. They're providing essentially the same product or the same service, but at a much lower cost, if you will. The last point I'll just make about ethical frameworks and civil society, and my time is almost up, sorry, sorry, hold on, I got to dismiss this timer. There we go, thank you. I think one of the problems or one of the issues is really a fear of dependency, and I understand that. There's a fear in the US of dependency. These companies are very big, they're very powerful, and the question is, who ultimately has control? And then secondly, there's a whole, and the answer to that to me though, is that countries ultimately have control. I'm very skeptical of a global framework for ethics. I don't think we'll get one ever because, China's ethics are different than the US ethics and other countries have different ethics. We're not going to all agree on an ethical framework. The US might say, well, we don't really want stringent privacy rules as much as say Europe does. But I don't think that fundamentally is a problem because if a country, I don't know, let's say Nigeria or India or Pakistan, if they think that they want a particular framework for anybody selling AI services in their countries, they just put that into law. They say any company that's selling AI services in our country has to comply with this law. And that'll be what happens. Companies have to abide by product safety laws. They have to abide by all these other laws. I don't see this as really any different. The last thing I'll just say about civil society, I think to me, the most important thing civil society can do is I think our earlier speaker alluded, there's an enormous set of things that obviously the market doesn't deal with, but applying these technologies could, for example, sex trafficking, monitoring health, diseases that that the big companies don't deal with because of the cost issues, the revenue issues. So there is, I think, really, really a huge opportunity. And I think the only way that really works well is for a lot of coordination and cooperation. I mean, the same issues in one country of say worker exploitation and how could you use technology to empower workers, they're going to be the same in other countries. And so I think figuring out how to get joint solutions and joint learning on that is really, really critical. So I guess my point would be, we want to go forward, we want to advance the technology, and then I would argue a big role for civil society is to figure out these gaps that aren't going to be met and how they can work with all the players to help solve those gaps. So thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Let me come to Peter now. Peter, after hearing all these thoughts, what is your thinking, your perspective, particularly, not just your perspective, what is Africa's thinking on this subject, that how can there be better access to this technology in a socially just manner? So over to you, Peter, in about 8 minutes.
Thank you, Kat, starting with Pradeep and Vipul, for organizing this very timely debate, and also to the other co-organizers, UNCTAD and the South Center. Yes, we've had a lot about perspectives from the West, and I'm not going to make a perspective from an African context. First of all, I do agree with the speakers. Most of the speakers, what has been said is really important, especially when you look at the last speaker has just mentioned dependency. Those of us in the digital space talk about the digital colonialism and the fact that many of these large corporations are based in the West, and particularly in the US. But we're now starting to see a few multinationals from China, and India is also picking up in terms of the digital capacities. So we're also seeing companies that are based in India coming to Africa and generally globally, expanding globally. So this is an interesting time. We'll see how it goes. So I think this is where Africa is lagging behind, because if you look at Africa, I think we are still at a very critical stage when it comes to building our own capacities. And when we have, while we have some few successes, or some few countries which have some, notable successes when it comes to digitization and technology, or rather information technology, we have a big challenge now when it comes to the frontier technologies, because this is something new. And many countries have a problem with the skills capacity. And this is not just at the government or the public sector level. This also touches on the civil society, many of whom obviously do not have the resources to engage in these policy debates with both the government and the private sector. So this is something, looking at the civil society in Africa, this is a big concern, but the concern cuts across, both the public as well as the private sector. So the challenge, therefore, is that maybe the policies that are being developed at the moment may not be very favorable, and may not work as effectively as those in countries which have the capacity to come up with to formulate the right policies. But then the other issue is that debates on technology, including frontier technologies in Africa or in the sub-Saharan Africa, have mostly been dominated by commercial and economic considerations at the expense of social issues, because governments in sub-Saharan Africa are keen to attract investments for economic growth and job creation. You're all aware about the jobs crisis in sub-Saharan Africa, and therefore they have prioritized the adoption and use of technologies without taking into consideration or not prioritizing these other factors. So this is a challenge for civil society, who obviously, being in touch with the ground or understanding the local context, would be working to have a broader debate as opposed to just economic and commercial issues. So whether it's artificial intelligence, which yes, has a commercial angle, but it also has security aspects which governments are also keen to exploit or leverage, or robotics and clean energy technology and Internet of Things, there's need to integrate the social impact aspects into this conversation. And now having these frontier technologies being gradually adopted in piecemeal fashion is something that sparks a lot of debate. I have been in conversations where obviously from a data privacy perspective or from an ethics perspective, you would find that governments, certain African governments, don't want to have that debate for obvious reasons. And therefore then what should the civil society do, and how should the civil society respond to to such developments? A third thing is now, touching on that then now, is the issue of human rights and principles for meaningful access to and use of frontier technologies. So I just want, if you look at the vaccine debate at the moment, there's what now with the COVID-19 virus, we have what we're currently having the vaccine apartheid, where countries with the vaccine, can go on with their slowly going back to normalcy, and they are holding the vaccines, and these countries without the vaccines are now stuck and are literally pleading for the vaccines. And you can imagine now the situation with these countries, the desperation and the challenge that they're facing. So this is also we're also experiencing this now with the frontier technologies. If countries have to, some countries have access to certain technologies, which from a maybe healthcare perspective, financial perspective, and even from a general just economic well-being perspective, these technologies have created a high standard of living, And if you go to countries which even just lack the infrastructure, because most of these frontier technologies are riding on certain infrastructures. So electricity is a problem. ICT, broadband connectivity is a challenge if you're going to look at 5G and Internet of Things, and many other examples that I can give. So, what does this mean for the global economy, especially when you look at in terms of the divide? So, it's going to be very difficult from an economic, but also from a human rights perspective, keeping in mind that governments have an obligation to upgrade the standard of living of their people. So this is not something that should just be left to governments, and civil society groups are raising these issues. But I think one of the challenge has been government's appreciation of understanding, and also appreciation of the angle or the perspective of civil society. So perhaps there could be a framing challenge from the civil society's side. Obviously, like I mentioned, because of the capacity, and certain areas are very narrow and they're very technical. So you might find that you don't have the people who can frame these issues. So yes, there's the activism angle, but sometimes I think the issues are, some governments appreciate a different type of engagement, and not necessarily just the normal civil society methods or approaches that have been used in the past, because they're also grappling with these technologies. They're also trying to figure out how to integrate them or how to leverage them. So I am from an academia perspective, and we have what you call the triple helix model, which is private sector, government, and academia. And you can notice civil society is never in the room when you're talking about these triple helix models. So there's need for more models or broader conversations or platforms which incorporate the civil society, and also like multi-stakeholder platform. But beyond that, I think there is also an obligation by groups in the developed or the G20 countries and the advanced economies to help these civil societies in the global south, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, to be able to engage in this high level policy debates and technological debates, because like I said, if you don't have the capacity to engage, then sometimes you might be seen as a nuisance, whereas you're really not capable of engaging on these technologies. And remember, because of the commercial considerations, some governments like from various countries are very keen to have these technologies because of their own benefits as governments. So we can't tell the governments to stop adopting or using these technologies, but we could find a way of intervening or finding a way of mediating the probably what you would refer to as adverse effects of using these technologies. So I don't think, from my perspective, I think that it will be good to have these broad multi-stakeholder conversations, but then the question is whether you have the people who understand these conversations and who can actually frame the issues and engage in this conversation in a manner that is then appreciated, as opposed to being seen as a barrier or a problem, because sometimes people feel like civil society can come across as a barrier, whereas it's really an issue of framing of the issues. So I think I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Let me now turn to Mike. Mike, do you think that these new technologies can reach and benefit poor communities? How do we do that? That's the question that we would like you to address in about 7-8 minutes. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Vipul. I'd like to just relate our experience at the Association for Progressive Communications in trying to appropriate some of these new technologies. And in particular, we are a membership-based organization primarily in the Global South with UN ECOSOC status, and we're an ITUD member. And one of our particular preoccupations is on improving access generally to the internet amongst rural and disenfranchised communities. And, we see the access to affordable, high-speed, high-quality internet as really underpinning a lot of the potential for innovation in the sector. We've seen a lot of projects over the last 20 years trying to support this kind of innovation, but if there's not an affordable, low-cost, high-speed connectivity, then a lot of the services and applications just are not going to be developed locally. The cost of using them means that the market is seen as being very small, and the cost of deploying them is relatively high compared to the number of users. So unless we see that very broad scale access at an affordable rate, we're not going to see the level of innovation and uptake of the innovations that are potentially there. So my work in the what we call the LockNet program in APC is to try and see how we can improve that level of connectivity down to the smallest and most remote communities. And one of the areas that's been coming up more and more recently is self-provisioning of connectivity, where communities have given up waiting for affordable mobile broadband to arrive in their area and have started to look at ways of actually setting up their own physical infrastructure using low-cost, off-the-shelf commodity routers and Wi-Fi hardware. And a couple of our members found that these devices didn't really provide all the functionality that they could require, and they were able to build on a community of open source developers that had been modifying router software to suit the purposes of particular communities, whether this is a need for session logging, for certain regulatory requirements, or mesh networking to improve the throughput and ease with which networks can be deployed. The problem was that proprietary solutions didn't provide the kind of tools that they needed. And they were able to actually develop fairly sophisticated operating software, but then a new router would come out which wouldn't support the application anymore and the operating firmware. And so they'd have to go back to the drawing board and recode and reverse engineer the routers. So in the end, our group in Argentina gave up on this and actually developed an open source router called the Libra Router, open hardware, developing the design which is available for download. Anyone can manufacture it locally. Interestingly enough, though, of course, many of the chips are still proprietary. It's impossible to get away from the big chip manufacturers entirely at this point, but we're still hopeful. And after having the initial prototypes manufactured in China, we're now also looking at the dynamic of having them manufactured more locally, because we found, for example, that shipping costs and import duties actually double the cost of these devices by the time they got into the hands of the local communities. So we're looking at ways of increasing the economies of scale by having large companies adopt the use of these routers, and then small non-profit communities and civil society groups can also make use of those economies of scale. So this is a process that we're actively researching at the moment, and we're looking at leveraging things like universal service funds to try and get those kind of economies of scale and the demand and awareness of these kinds of solutions that really make it possible for the local communities to customize and translate into the local language, or just make these tools more useful for the communities. And it's incredible how much innovation is available in the communities when they have the tools that allow them to use them at a cheap and affordable rate. I'll leave it at there and happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. We're yet to receive any questions or comments in the chat box. I should have said that in the beginning, that you can post questions or thoughts, comments on the chat box. Anyway, so in the interest of time, let me now request Shamika, Carlos, and Pradeep, after hearing all this, what are their final thoughts on the subject? Of course, this is a work in progress, but it would be good to hear their thoughts after hearing all the panelists. So Shamika, maybe you first.
I could, but perhaps we should start the other way around. Maybe I'll end.
Okay. So let me then request Carlos.
Okay. Yes. All right. Well, thank you. It has been a very interesting debate, I would say, because there have been different views on the same subject. Well, I think in particular some of the comments that were made in relation to the extent to which developing countries are dependent or can actually exploit to their benefits technology. There are different views. As I mentioned before, I think this is also one of the main conclusions of the report. Developing countries face a major challenge in implementing these technologies. As I mentioned before, is not automatic. Leapfrog will not take place. It will require investment. It will require the creation of skills in the countries. As it was mentioned also, there is a diversity. The case of India has been highlighted. The case of China has also been highlighted, but this is not the situation in most developing countries. So therefore, there is a lot still to be done. And I think I welcome the report by UNTAD because it contains, as I mentioned before, a lot of very useful information, good analysis. And I think the situation has not changed as compared to the previous techno-economic paradigms. There is a need to ensure that all developing countries can make use of this technology, but also participate in the innovation process. I think this is crucial. Developing countries should not be seen just as users of the technology. This may bring some increases in productivity eventually, but this, as it was also mentioned by Shamika, this will require further capital investment. This will destroy jobs, and therefore this is a full adaptation that our countries need to make in order to achieve the SDGs. So I think it's still need to look at the report carefully, and then for governments to put in place the measures that are needed in order to make use of these. Of course, everybody agrees these are powerful tools, but the benefits are not automatic. So you need to be able to use them in the right way. And this, I think, is the main message of the report, which is welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. Pradeep, any final thought? You have to unmute.
Except to thank all the panelists once again on behalf of Cuts International, which I'm sure you will do, and on behalf of UNTAD. But to say in conclusion as to something which is a takeaway that I think would be important is, Shamika, how do you demystify some of these issues for a wider appreciation by the civil society? I think that is very important, and short, brief, one-pagers for the civil society globally to understand as to what are the issues and what is it that they can do and what is it that they should do in terms of absorption, in terms of advocacy, particularly, as was pointed out by various panelists, that we have this triumvirate of civil society, businesses, and government. And what do we do in order to ensure that the civil society voices are heard as standard? But more importantly, their capacity needs to be built to understand these issues so that they can advocate correctly rather than on the basis of rhetoric, which they often hear and get confused. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradeep. I mean, this is very, very important. And before I request Shamika for her final thoughts, particularly on the point which Pradeep has just raised, let me say one or two things. One is that this debate reminds me about the genesis of our work, or the beginning of our work on trade and economic issues in early 1990s. I mean, there's a lot of confusion, etc. But that time we devised a tagline or a slogan, which is liberalization, yes, but with safety nets. So here we have to keep in mind that we are not Luddites. We are not here to discard these new technologies. We have to embrace them. So technology, yes, but with those 5 A's that your report has elaborated upon, which Carlos has talked about and others have also talked about. That's number one. And number two, and that means that we have to see to it that how we can engage with private sector I'm not at all saying that private sector is bad, that we should not engage with them, but it's a question of how we're going to engage with them. So we have to have a paradigm shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. And here the stakeholders are the civil society at large, the private sector, the government, and the communities, civil society. We have to work together. So that is the message that we need to carry forward, along with demystification, capacity building, and various other efforts that we need to make. So with this, let me now request Shamika for her final words.
Thank you, Bipul. I just would like to take the opportunity to thank all of you for the South Center and CUTS for working with us to get this webinar going, and for the excellent panelists and bringing your perspectives from various different places that you work, so that we understand and we take this message forward. I think, Bipul, we all know technological revolutions have bypassed continents. Just take the Green Revolution, last one that we saw. And I have lived in 2 continents, and I've seen how one continent has enormously benefited from the Green Revolution and how it has bypassed another full continent altogether. So this technological revolution that we are living through now is just at the beginning, and it is a much more powerful and an all-encompassing technological change. It's a transformative technological revolution that we are confronted with. So I think it is extremely important for us to have these sort of discussions in different fora, so that we can make sure that this particular technological revolution will not bypass anyone, and it will not just work for the few, but it will be inclusive, and it will work for all of us. And I think it's extremely important. We are not just in the realm of intergovernmental meetings and we just talk to each other, but we get to different stakeholder groups and bring begin a conversation. And then we need to converge all different stakeholder points of view, because everyone has a role. It's not just the government, it's not just the private sector, it's the civil society, it's the international community, it's the United Nations. We all have a role to play to make sure that this particular technological revolution that we are just beginning to live through will not just deliver only for a few. So this is the message I want to bring to you, and this is what I heard from the messages that you brought to fore. But I also hear that we need a lot more to do, to build awareness, to build these movements from different groups towards this, the emerging transformation in front of us. So thank you, Bipul. So this is where I stop.
Thank you, Shamika. Thank you, everybody. We look forward to work with Untitled, South Center, and other organizations to take this agenda forward. This is too important for us to ignore, if I may use that word. So on behalf of CUTS, Untitled and South Center, let me once again thank all of you for your time, for your thoughts, this important subject, and we'll be in touch with each other in order to take this debate and deliberations forward. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.